Good afternoon from the headquarters of the United Nations Development Program in New York. It's a pleasure to greet you and to welcome you on behalf of the Peace Park Development and Management team to the third and last webinar of the Peace Park Development and Management MOOC, offered by the United Nations Development Program in partnership with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, its Peace and Biodiversity Dialogue Initiative, and the NBCEP Forum. Financial support is provided by the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity's Peace and Biodiversity Dialogue Initiative, funded by the Ministry of Environment of the Republic of Korea. My name is Victoria Brzezieniuk, and I'm your course facilitator. We're grateful for your participation in this webinar titled Challenges and Lessons Learned, which will be presented by Mr. Carl Brook. Mr. Brook is the Director of International Programs at the Environmental Law Institute and the founding president of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. An authority on environmental governance, he has helped dozens of countries throughout Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Europe strengthen their environmental laws, institutions, and practices. His work focuses on environmental peacebuilding, especially after conflict, environmental governance, adaptation, and environmental emergencies. He has provided technical and legal assistance, built capacity, and conducted research across Africa, the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific and Eastern Europe, including many conflict-affected countries. He has edited more than 10 books and authored more than 80 journal articles, book chapters, and reports. Welcome, Carl, and thank you for accepting this invitation. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you. It's wonderful. I'm going to be talking about a number of things today, largely focusing on how peace parks fit into the bigger picture, tying into a number of the challenges that were highlighted in the webinar, in the earlier lectures. I did want to say a little bit about my background. I'm a lawyer, but I also approach this from a broader environmental policy and management perspective, and it's very interesting to see how these different tools relate. And so it's not about the law, it's much more about how the institutions and governance and societies work in these different contexts. So I'm going to start by, I'm going to turn my camera off while we go through the PowerPoint, and then I'll open it back up for the discussion. So I'm going to do two things today. One is I'd like to place the issues of peace park development and management in the broader context of environmental peace building, and share some lessons and practices from environmental peace building that may be of use for those working on peace parks. And then do the same thing for environmental rule of law, and I'll explain both of these terms as I get to them. So environmental peace building is the process of governing and managing natural resources and the environment to support durable peace. It spans the conflict life cycle, and it includes efforts to prevent, mitigate, resolve, and recover from violent conflict. It includes a broad range of environmental and natural resource considerations, renewable resources such as land, water, and fisheries. And I should note that simply because resources are renewable, it doesn't mean that they are managed sustainably, but they can be managed sustainably. These are fundamentally different from non-renewable resources such as minerals, oil, and gas, and this can have an effect on the conflict dynamics. And then finally, ecosystems and their services. Environmental peace building applies at multiple levels, between countries, within countries, and at the local and regional levels. It applies to both violent and armed conflict as well as to social conflict. One of the things that I think is so interesting about environmental peace building is that it links diverse concepts and activities. Everything from how to govern natural resources and benefit sharing in a transparent manner to sustain peace or build confidence between stakeholders, to preventing or reducing environmental threats to human health and livelihoods and the environment caused by violent conflict. dealing with conflict resources or developing natural resources in a conflict-sensitive manner. A lot of these different areas that people work in isolated niches, these all have very similar dynamics as they're working at the intersection of environment, conflict, and peace. And as such, there's a lot that we can learn from one another in bringing together these diverse activities. And so environmental peace building provides a framework for contextualizing and linking tools for managing environmental risks and opportunities across the conflict lifecycle. So here's the conflict lifecycle. Now, I should note that we initially started talking about the conflict cycle, but a lot of people feel that this is too deterministic, that we don't always go into conflict and out of conflict. So sometimes you have a relapse to conflict, unfortunately all too often, but it's still generally less than 50%. Some put it at about 25% over 10 years. It's interesting to think basically about the different phases of conflict, from the from the causes of conflict and how disputes escalate to violence, to the conduct of conflict during the violence, and then recovery and peace building after conflict. And there's often a fourth phase that is mentioned, that people talk about here, which is the mediation and peacemaking part of the process. So this is broadly, you see here, going from an unstable peace to crisis to armed conflict. And when you have peacemaking and peacekeeping, it's an unstable peace to a stable peace to a durable peace. And the hope and the aim of peace building efforts is to prevent conflict, to resolve it, to recover from it, and prevent a relapse. So if we talk about where environment factors in, we see both risks here in red and opportunities here in black. And environmental peace building incorporates all of those, addressing the risks and promoting the opportunities. So we see here that environmental disputes and inequitable sharing of revenues, wide-scale land grabbing, these can cause tensions and grievances that can escalate disputes to violence. So one of the solutions to preventing disputes from escalating to conflict is good resource governance. During conflict, we see natural resources fueling and financing and helping to drive conflict. Environment can be a weapon of war, and as such, it can also be damaged by conflict. At the same time, shared interests in the environment can be an entry point for dialogue. It can provide economic incentives to end conflict and to build confidence. Then after conflict, natural resources in the environment both provide an incentive for peace spoiling and can be illegally exploited and traded, but it also provides livelihood opportunities, revenues, helps to rebuild the economy, provides revenues for basic services. So this captures many of the ways that the environment provides both risks and opportunities across the conflict life cycle. At each stage of conflict, there are broadly 5 dimensions of peace building: security, economic, governance and political, basic services, and cooperation and social. And in each of these, environment and natural resources offer important opportunities and risks. And if we look specifically at the context of peace parks, we see that much of the emphasis focuses on cooperation. And that is, to be sure, one of the major benefits and opportunities of peace parks to help build peace at a local level, at a regional level, and even between countries. But to focus only on cooperation undersells the various benefits that peace parks can have for peace building. So they can enhance livelihood opportunities and generate revenues both locally and for the country. They provide job opportunities for ex-combatants, and as such, they can improve both post-conflict stability and transboundary security. At the same time, unfortunately, it can provide a refuge for non-state armed groups, and it can be a risk that needs to be addressed. Some of the infrastructure that is developed for peace parks, whether it's roads or basic services, this is often a peace dividend for people in the areas. It can help to improve local lives. And one of the questions that parks face all over is how to manage the competing demands on that infrastructure. And finally, governance. We see that with peace parks, it's important to manage the area equitably, fairly, to manage in a cooperative manner, often engaging the public broadly, but especially the communities in the area. So we see here that working on peace parks is, to be sure, they're a very important entry point for dialogue and cooperation, but they also have these other benefits and impacts on peace building more broadly. I want to talk a little bit about governance, because one of the things that we've seen working on environmental peace building is that people come to the topic from very diverse backgrounds. You have people who work on conservation, including on peace parks, people who work on community-based natural resource management, people who work on environmental protection, as well as security, development, corruption, and good governance. And so they come at it from many different angles. I assume that most of the people here are focusing more on the peace park side, on the governance of natural resources. And it's important to realize that governance in conflict-affected contexts is different from many of the other contexts that we may work in. And so when we work on peace parks and on other environmental programs in conflict-affected countries and conflict-affected situations, we need to keep in mind these differences. The first is that peace-building priorities drive donor efforts, country efforts, and community efforts. There's high unemployment, there are high expectations, and as such, if you want to get political attention and funding, you need to frame this in the context of how is this going to assist the peace-building process. And with that, I would say it's important to come back to some of these different objectives and how peace parks can help to build security, economic recovery, good governance, basic services, and cooperation. In-country capacity is often devastated, and we're used to working in situations where the park police don't have necessary vehicles, you don't have enough staff to properly cover the whole area. But in many cases, conflict-affected countries have it's even thinner capacity, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. Especially after conflict, we see that the dynamics are very fluid. Things can change rapidly, and there's often insecurity that we see influencing how programming is done. And so it's important to be alert to these changes and the uncertainty. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things that happens, especially in conflict-affected settings is that people have adopted short-term coping strategies just to survive, just to provide food and water, shelter. And these short-term strategies often undermine longer-term efforts. And part of the need in the post-conflict period is to transition people's ways of engagement from these coping strategies to longer-term, more sustainable approaches to livelihoods in particular. Trust is often at an all-time low. There are unresolved grievances that, when in the context of insecurity, can become very dangerous for people working on conservation. And then there are uncertain rights and overlapping claims as people have left land, other people have moved in. If you're trying to set up a peace park or a park of any sort, this can be a real challenge. And so I've highlighted a number of ways that governance is challenging and that it's different. I think it's also important to note that it's also an opportunity, especially after conflict. There's a window of opportunity where people are tired of the war, of the conflict, of the stress, and they're often willing to try new approaches. And we see in a number of contexts, this is when peace parks have been established, such as the Cordillera del Condor between Peru and Ecuador. And I think that it's important to think about this not only as a set of risks, but also as some real opportunities for introducing new ways of managing parks and the environment more broadly. One of the greatest challenges is that people are often unaware that even if they're trying to do good, they're trying to protect the environment, maybe fight climate change, build peace, provide livelihoods, and in this context, never crosses their mind that they might actually be causing harm. And the problem is that people, conservationists are trained in biology, programming, and a lot of things, but they're not necessarily trained in conflict sensitivity. And so it's really important to be alert to both the potential for inadvertently doing harm and to then be adaptable to be able to respond to problems as they arise. And I think that in this context, we see the growth of conflict-sensitive conservation, conflict-sensitive programming. And I would highlight, among other things, there's a handbook that IISD produced on conflict-sensitive conservation. And Conservation International has also developed a similar handbook on environmental peace building that introduces a series of tools for conflict sensitivity. And so there are some very good tools out there for those who are interested. Conflict sensitivity refers to the ability of an organization to A, understand the context in which it's operating, B, understand the interaction between their intervention, say building a peace park, and that context, and C, act upon that understanding in order to avoid negative impacts and maximize positive impacts on the conflict. And here, I think it's important to, in that last point, first of all, it's both about avoiding negative impacts and maximizing positive impacts. And it's not just, yes, you want to maximize the positive impacts of your peace park, but the point here is thinking about it through the conflict lens. And so the key point here is not just about what you do, it's about how you do it and being careful. And so we'll talk about what that means. So in the context of designing peace parks and the different activities of the parks and how they operate, vitally important that we be sensitive to the particular circumstances of local practices in the areas that we work. Well-intentioned but insensitive initiatives can generate grievances and potentially increase tensions. For example, if we restrict access to resources that are necessary for livelihoods, or there are revenues that are generated by the park, and these are not shared, at least in part, with the local communities. And so being conflict sensitive means that we know the causes, the effects, the actors, and the dynamics of a conflict, and that we base our actions on that understanding. So when we design peace parks, we should really think about who benefits. Are you hiring people predominantly from one ethnic group or from one side of the conflict? Might that create a perception of bias? If you hire people from multiple groups or formerly groups that have been fighting, there's a question about how you make sure that they are not fighting when they are park rangers. And this was something that we saw in Gorongosa National Park, that they made a profound effort to rebuild people's identities, not around their identities as fighters, but as new park guards. Also want to focus on social cohesion. Does a peace park reinforce existing group dynamics, or does it promote cohesion across divisions in the region? And there are often unintended consequences that are foreseeable. So might a peace park have the potential to change property values in the area in a way that might lead to land grabbing? So those are all things to consider when designing peace parks. In implementing, we want to consult with communities at every stage and monitor and evaluate the settings. And I'll talk a little bit about M&E in a moment. But the point is that you need to make sure that you have conflict-sensitive indicators and that you are able to adapt, that you don't just stick to the plan, that as information becomes available and you see things starting to get tense, that you're able to adjust course. And then more broadly, the importance of training staff on conflict sensitivity, performing fragility or conflict assessments. And this last thing, it goes to the point I just said about adapting, but it's really important not to be locked in absolutely to this particular approach if that approach isn't going to work in this circumstance, or it might lead to conflict. I'll talk briefly about M&E. We could talk more about it in the discussion if you like, but the basic considerations for monitoring and evaluation, first of all, is to determine and improve effectiveness of a particular park or project, to learn from the evaluation and inform other, whether they're existing efforts or future efforts. It also is both a requirement of funding and necessary to get new funding. One of the things that I think is really important here is that some things are easier to measure. That simply because something's measurable doesn't mean that it's meaningful. You can talk about how many people you've hired, how many people live in the area, how much money is generated, how many hectares. These are all things that you can measure with some reasonable degree of reliance. But the question is, how does this influence peace or conflict or tensions? And that is much more difficult. And so one of the things that people are starting to do in the area of environmental peace building is really working with a combination of quantitative indicators and qualitative indicators, and looking at using theories of change. The second major area of my remarks relates to the environmental rule of law. And one of the things that we see, one of the greatest challenges, and this was highlighted in the lectures, is the implementation and enforcement of existing laws governing peace parks. It's easy enough to set the park up, to create the laws, but then you have to enforce. Parks struggle to cope with poachers and other intruders. They lack the staff, the equipment, and often the political will to effectively enforce park protections. I will note that this is not unique to peace parks. In a landmark report released last month, UN Environment focuses international attention on the need to improve implementation and enforcement of environmental laws broadly. UN Environment found that most countries have adopted a wide range of environmental laws and regulations, and they've established environmental ministries and agencies. Yet, in many cases, there are laws that must be followed and laws that are perceived as optional, and environmental laws and conservation laws often are perceived more as optional than binding. And one of the efforts, one of the reasons for focusing on environmental rule of law is to make sure that environmental laws have the force of law. And part of that is making the business case. Why is this important to the national treasury? Why is it important to peace? Why is it important to livelihoods? So part of it is making sure that people understand why these laws exist. And part of it is making sure that everyone is held accountable equally to publicly promulgated, independently adjudicated laws that are consistent with international norms and standards. And environmental rule of law is, I think, a major shift in how the international community is going to approach environmental law generally in the years moving forward. There are some major elements that we see that relate to laws, institutions, civic engagement, rights, and justice. So sound laws, including fair, clear, and implementable environmental laws, clear and coordinated mandates and roles across and within institutions, and specific criteria for the interpretation of environmental law. In institutions, we see accountability and integrity of institutions and decision makers, as well as the importance of smart design of institutions. Civic engagement focuses largely on access to information, public participation, and access to justice, but there's often a particular emphasis on women, indigenous peoples, and other historically marginalized groups. For rights, there's a recognition of the mutually reinforcing relationship between rights, and these are constitutional rights, human rights, statutory rights, and the environmental rule of law. This isn't just a question of standards, it's also a question of enforcing people's rights. And then justice is about both the effective administration of peaceful dispute resolution, as well as making sure that those mechanisms are accessible, they're fair, they're impartial, and they're timely. I want to just highlight a few of the dynamics that that link environmental rule of law to peace parks and conflict. One thing we see is that conflict often degrades rule of law. There are social breakdowns. It makes it more difficult to have civil dialogue and to resolve disputes peacefully. Government legitimacy is often weakened, especially outside of the capital. People adopt short-term coping mechanisms that may be inconsistent with the laws, but frankly, survival is a higher priority. You see the rise of informal actors and conflict resources. It also changes rule of law, and I want to be clear here. This is talking about how conflict degrades rule of law. It doesn't mean that there's no law or that there's no rule of law. Fundamentally, it often changes how people govern themselves. And as the statutory frameworks weaken, we see a rise of traditional institutions and armed groups, customary law. And so this is what's often referred to as legal pluralism, that is the simultaneous operation of multiple bodies of law. Post-conflict peace building seeks to either build or rebuild rule of law, And in this context, environment is critically important. Here are a number of measures. I won't go through each of them, but this is basically the sorts of things that one is focusing on in the environmental rule of law context. And you can see how these might apply to peace parks, whether it's addressing corruption, or building political will, engaging communities and customary institutions. There are tensions here, but I think that environmental rule of law offers a powerful framework to help address a lot of the challenges that we see in actually managing peace parks once they're set up. I'd like to close with a little pitch for those who are interested in environment, conflict, and peace. There is a new environmental peacebuilding association. This is a multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary forum that addresses a wide range of issues related to environment, conflict, and peace. It fosters knowledge development and exchange, builds capacity and awareness, and strengthens relationships between scholars and practitioners, decision makers, and others. So if you're interested, I encourage you to check out environmentalpeacebuilding.org, and we have more than 250 people in over 50 countries that are already making environment a cause for peace. We have our first International Conference on Environmental Peacebuilding to be held October 23rd through 25th, 2019. Again, that's October 23rd through 25, 2019. And with that, I'd like to open this up for discussion.
Thank you very much, Carl. Yes, actually, we do already have questions, and just as a reminder for those participants that are joining us for the first time, you can share your questions in the chat window at the bottom of the screen, or you can raise your hand if you'd like to speak to Carl and ask your question yourself. We can open your mic or read your question depending on your preference. And with this, I'd like to start with the first question. And this is a question from Quinton. Quinton says, in South Africa, a lot of the national dialogue currently revolves around land expropriation. The risk of land expropriation without compensation has moved many wildlife farmers, hunting property owners, to formally protect their property for conservation ends. The idea being that the legislation makes the practical process of expropriation more complex. Is this a type of conflict that can be positively exploited for peace park establishment and conservation goals?
I think that some of the linkages between land and peace parks are some of the most interesting ones. People are often very, very connected to the land, especially where you have generations. My parents lived here, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. They have a long connection to family and history and social connections. That deep identity is really important. One of the things that I think is the question of peace parks, and can you use people's efforts to try to I'm skirting an issue here. I apologize for that, but we see in many cases that people love the land, that they want to protect it. They introduce what are called conservation easements, and this gives them tax benefits. Basically, they promise not to develop the land, that it's going to be used for wildlife, for protected areas, but it's held by the private individual. And this is often a way that people, whether it becomes a future park or it's a buffer zone to a park, this is a way of extending parks and the benefits of biodiversity. I think the questions of if this is being used as a tool to avoid expropriation it's easy enough to change the laws. So I would be careful about relying overly on that in the moment. I think in the longer term, though, working with people who are committed for whatever reason to using to providing habitat and biodiversity protections with their land, I think that that's a great. There are definitely opportunities to engage people in that.
Thank you, Carl. Quentin, I hope that answers your question. If you have a follow-up question or comment, I'm happy to open your microphone at any time during the session. And at this point, I'd like to jump to the next question from Alexander. What are the key resources for obtaining funding for on-the-ground work to create a peace park? Are there any? Is there any specific funding for peace and conflict applicable for peace parks?
I'd like to ask Alexander what he would say about that.
Well, actually, we can.
While Alex is thinking about it, I might say there are. This sort of space can be difficult because you have a lot of people who work on conservation, funders and institutions and sources that focus on conservation. Then you have others that focus on peace and security. And on the one hand, you could say peace parks opens up both pots of money, but it gets difficult because often the peace and security people are not used to, they look at this as an environmental project, and the environmental people say, geez, there's a lot of risk here. And so I think that it both opens up and makes more difficult the traditional sources of funding. One thing that sometimes you see this happening through diplomatic efforts, so ministries of foreign affairs, and then by extension the bilateral donors, whether it's for the countries involved or for third parties. You do see from time to time substantial investment of private donors. I mentioned Gorongosa. That was a project that the park had been largely substantially degraded by the civil war in Mozambique, and it really was a private U.S. Individual who put a lot of money into rebuilding the park. Now, I don't know where I would be looking for funding for this. Looking everywhere, but there aren't that many well-established places that I'm familiar with. But Alex, maybe you have thoughts on. It's a wonderful question. This is one of the biggest constraints.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. As you probably know, the Peace and Biodiversity Dialogue Initiative has some small opportunity to support workshops to establish peace parks cooperation with 3-4 countries together. And I easily imagine that this is the most important question we will get immediately. If we start something, how we can get sustainable funding in the future. So your ideas, especially from environmental peace building perspective, is very important. I know that UN Environment provides some funds to African countries for environmental peace building, but maybe some other organizations do this as well.
I would also look at the Global Environment Facility, and particularly the biodiversity component of that. I don't know how much they have done on peace parks, but there's an ongoing discussion within the Global Environment Facility about the important linkages between the various environmental objectives and environmental security, environmental peace building more broadly. So that's kind of an ongoing set of pot of funding that might be available. I don't know how often that has been used for peace parks to date.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Now, jumping to our next question from Neil, and I'm so glad Neil is asking this question because that was my question as well. Neil says, Carl, you mentioned the challenge in finding the balance between short-term coping strategies and long-term efforts. With limited resources and shifting variables, this is a difficult balance to strike. Can you share any examples that stand out as being particularly successful at striking this balance? And Carl, if I may just add to this, coming from a background that is conflict affected myself, I'm asking myself this question often. In communities that are focusing on short-term strategies, how does one encourage them to see a situation as an opportunity, which is something you mentioned in your presentation?
Part of it is getting people back into their homes. That when you're in a camp and you're just trying to make sure that you've got water and food and fuel for today, that's what you focus your energies on. When you get back home, you still have to worry about water, food, and shelter, but you also have the chance of building, planting the crops, maintaining the crops, maintaining livestock, but trying to build for the longer term. But it's hard to just kind of get people back into their homes for multiple reasons. One thing that we've seen is that there's often efforts to provide people with food for work or jobs, short-term jobs, even as you're trying to build the longer-term niches. It takes a while to create new livelihood opportunities. And so one of the things that people have done, they start out with food for work or short-term jobs. And in this context, the Afghan Conservation Corps, I think, is one of the most interesting examples that we're trying to give people a way of making money to support themselves over the next 3 months, 6 months. It was a relatively short-term employment for a lot of people, but it was a bridge. It helped cover them while they were able to look for longer-term employment opportunities. And what they did was they replanted areas that had been deforested. They rebuilt, restored the Karez system. These are the irrigation system in Afghanistan. They did a lot of things that were more long-term, even if it was a short-term job. So I think that looking at some of those models, I think it's not going to be the solution, but there are lots of these specific tools that one can use.
Thank you for these great points, Carl. Our next question is from Muse. It's very context specific, so let's see. Why is there no peace park and conservation project in Somalia, and particularly the borders between Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia to reduce conflict and promote security?
Well, the simple solution is there isn't the leadership, the political will. But I think the tougher answer is, why isn't there the leadership? Why don't people want to do this? And I don't know the context well enough, to be honest. I think that asking this question is a great way to get people to start thinking about it. And I think that it ties in, some of this is the cooperation, but gee, this might be a way of also then developing livelihoods and cooperation and looking at those multiple peace-building objectives. So I don't know if other people are more familiar with the dynamics between Ethiopia and Somalia, or for that matter, Somalia and Kenya. One of the things that I think is sorry, I should also come back, amend my statement. The peace parks can start from top down or bottom up, and part of it is a question of having the governments say that they want to have a peace park. Part of it is convincing the governments of that. And so even with the Cordillera del Condor, this wasn't something that the governments just thought up. IUCN and one of the, there's a couple of NGOs, one international, one or two local NGOs that had been developing the idea. They had it sufficiently developed. And when the peace came between Ecuador and Peru over the border war, the governments were very receptive to this idea. And so that came from the NGOs. And the peace parks, the peace park that is under development in the Balkans has been led very much from the communities. And so I think that whether it becomes a peace park depends on timing and eventually, but I think eventually that will be a model peace park. And I think that that's something that we can have. You can approach it from the top down, from the bottom up, or laterally, and it's also possible to work on having something between Kenya and Somalia that you then bring Ethiopia into. So I think that it's a great question, and I think that it really depends on people showing leadership, not just in government, but in the communities and in civil society.
Thank you, Carl. As a reminder to participants, if you have a follow-up question or a comment to any of Carl's responses, we're very happy to open your microphone or read your comment or follow-up question. And our next question is from, actually rather a comment, not a question, from Fanuel. Inasmuch as peace parks are appreciated for peace building and development, there is a notion that this is another form of denying indigenous communities from owning the natural resources. Instead, under peace parks, they're just passengers in a moving train. Would you be able to comment on that?
I think it's a really good comment. I think it applies not just to peace parks, but to parks more generally. Mm-hmm. This is a problem, not a problem. This dynamic happens in a lot of situations, and you have different visions of what a park should be. Is it nature with the exclusion of people? Is it people within nature? If people are in nature, how much can they develop or use the area? And so I think that often historically, indigenous peoples and traditional peoples that may not be indigenous, they've often been, there have been efforts just to move them off the land. So I think that has often been the case. It doesn't need to be the case. And I think that over the last 20 years, there have been many examples where indigenous people, traditional peoples have been able to stay on the land and work in a collaborative way, developing a vision of what the park should look like, how it should be managed. And I think that more participatory approach is where a lot of countries are going.
Thank you, Carl. Our next question is from Mohammed. Do you think there is an opportunity to establish a peace park in the countries of Middle East where the conflicts still exist?
Why? I think there's a question of while the conflicts still exist. I think that's. I'm trying to think of examples where that has happened. Often this peace parks may be empowered or created when you have the end of a conflict as part of the peace agreement or as adjacent to or supporting peace agreement. There are things that one can do while the conflict is ongoing. but I think the question is, what's the incentive for the governments to actually formally designate, to come together and create a peace park at this particular time? I would love to have people's thoughts on how this would work. And I think, Middle East, there's a lot of countries in the Middle East, a lot of conflicts. I don't know if he's referring to Israel, Jordan, Palestine, or Iraq, Syria, Euphrates Tigris Basin. I suspect that this is more on the Israel, Jordan, Palestine, and I think that there are opportunities there. I think that the opportunity is more by way of laying the ground and thinking about what would make sense for a peace park, where would it be, and doing this from bottom up. So you could certainly start on that now. I don't know. And sometimes you can get a couple of people, a couple of the countries to agree to a peace park, even if it doesn't have all the actors there. So you might be able to get Israel and Jordan to agree to a peace park, even if Israel and Palestine might not be ready to agree on their particular respective components of that. I would welcome other people's thoughts on this. This is a really good question.
Thank you, Carl. Yes, dear participants, if you have any specifications to this question or any thoughts that you'd like to share, please feel free, or feel free to raise your hand and we'll open your microphone. And in the meantime, we have a question from Nina. My question is about important aspects to take into account when it comes to capacity building in fragile states willing to create a peace park.
I'm just wondering, could we contextualize this a little?
I'm sorry?
I'm wondering about Nina's question. Is this a general question, or if we can contextualize this a little, it might be easier to answer it in a meaningful way.
Right. Nina, if you could share some more context, I'm also happy to open your microphone. 1 second. Let's see if it works. It doesn't seem to be working, actually. Oh, she said it's a general question.
Okay. I'm afraid of that. Okay. I would say that part of it depends on where you are in the process. Has the peace park already been established? If you're talking about establishing a peace park, then I would say that there's a certain amount of capacity building that's done not only of the government officials, but also of the key stakeholders as you are thinking about how to design a peace park, how to, what the boundaries should be, how to deal with people who are on the land, how is this going to be financed in the short term, in the longer term, developing a business model, what are the rules for use of the park, how are these going to be enforced? So there are all those sorts of questions about developing the vision and having the capacity to get a shared vision. I would also say that this is where a lot of the conflict sensitivity, you want to make sure that you have awareness of how to talk to one another when you have different views, when people don't trust one another. And I think that there are some very interesting approaches, but thinking about not just the developing that common vision, but making sure that people have the skills to listen to what other people are saying and to help find a common ground for the park. If you're talking about once the park's already been established, I would say that you have some of the similar issues about how do we enforce, how do we monitor, There are questions about what to do when you find someone, if it's a poacher or land grabber, how do you engage with them? Is this a simple law enforcement effort? Is it more of a social dynamic? I've seen this done in different parks where by rights, the park ranger could have arrested the person and tried them and put them in jail, but often there's a softer approach that is meant less on having justice and more on having a mutually agreeable outcome. That may include talking to people, letting them, making sure that they know that fishing is not allowed or whatever it is, or it's transforming that differing vision through dialogue about, okay, people need to have certain uses. Can we, moving forward, designate certain areas for certain types of use and other areas as off limits? And so I think that there's a, for a lot of park people, the skills of conflict management, conflict resolution, conflict sensitivity, these are things that people often are not trained in. And I think that that's where I would be focusing my energies more on the skills that they were, you know, when they were trained as a on park management and environmental conservation, they received all the environmental skills. They didn't necessarily receive the conflict management skills.
Thank you, Carl. This is a really great point, and this is something that one of the lessons of the MOOC touches upon specifically, and really makes this point. Our next question is from Andrew. Andrew says, "Thank you, Carl, for a very informative session today. My question concerns peace parks and the rule of law. When we speak about rebuilding rule of law following conflict, what about the risk of re-empowering oppressive state institutions in a context of de facto legal pluralism? I'm thinking in particular of the Selwyn Peace Park in Myanmar, where a non-state armed group, the Karen National Union, is developing a grassroots governance model that so far is independent of the Myanmar government's legal system, in a bid to build peace, transform the conflict, and press a more just legal framework for land and environmental governance."
So I would say there are key points here. One is recognizing the law is not always just. So rule of law, you want to be careful about just blindly implementing the laws or enforcing the laws that exist. As the UN views rule of law, though, rule of law includes a respect for rights. It requires that the laws be equitable. And so there is a question, what happens when the law that we're talking about is not equitable? It's a tool of oppression. And I think that that's where both social movements and the international community have a role. But I think that Andrew raised a really good point there about the underlying law. And the example he used is a fascinating one. And I think Myanmar generally it's both a fascinating country, it's a beautiful country, and it's a very difficult country to work in. And the one thing that you do see in these situations where there might be a central government that is that the international community does not approve how they do certain things. You see bilateral donors often empowering, funding, supporting local groups. It may be regional, it might be community, but building their capacity and helping them to develop a vision. And so this is helping to build a bottom-up solution. So I think that all of this, it's important to understand the nuance. It's important to think about the context because one of the we often for those of us who live in societies where we're lawyers and we like the law and the law will be respected. That's great, but as Andrew said, it's not always equitable or even respectful of human rights. So I think we need to be alert to that and look at environmental rule of law more broadly as comprising human rights, constitutional rights, and working toward change where change needs to happen.
Thank you, Carl. Our next question, I'll try to summarize. We had it on the discussion forum, and you touched upon this this point briefly in your presentation when you spoke about the monitoring and evaluation framework. And you mentioned that if something is measurable, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's meaningful. So we should really pay close attention to qualitative data as well as quantitative information. So the question from the discussion forum was, how do we collect qualitative data in a systematic way and use it also systematically to guide the decision-making process together with quantitative data?
Good question. And I think that part of this is using, first part is, what are you trying to learn? What are the questions that you want to know more about? It may be that these are indicators, they might be broader questions. It might be that you are looking at the theory of change that was advanced at the beginning of the project. But starting with that, and then often there is use of extensive interviews. Yes, you're asking those certain questions, but if you sit down with someone for an hour or 2 hours, you hear things that may not be the questions you were asking, but they have a profound impact on the outcomes that you're trying to understand. And so it's having that initial framework of the indicators or the qualitative questions or the theory of change, and then doing extensive interviews and triangulation. Some of them are more, where you can get the quantitative data or the indicators, great, but a lot of it's asking, did this work? Did this have unexpected consequences? Did it? How did this affect this group or that group? What are the prospects for long-term sustainability of this intervention? And you start asking those questions, and you listen and let people talk, and things come up. And so I think one is talking for a long period with certain people, but the other is that you then try to triangulate and make sure you have a diversity of views. And you see areas where people have common understanding and areas where there are very different views, but it's really making sure that you are able to get as many different perspectives incorporated into that qualitative evaluation as possible.
Thank you very much, Carl. Again, a question that I'll try to link to the discussion forum a little bit. You spoke about coordinating cooperative efforts and building trust. From your experience, and you have a very rich experience in working in various countries around the world, can you give an example of some major challenges that you had maybe in this aspect of coordinating cooperative efforts and how you resolved those challenges?
So I'd like to draw upon some of the work that we did in Liberia. And we've worked the Environmental Law Institute has worked in Liberia since 2004, mostly on forestry, some on biodiversity, some on environmental management. And there are a lot of different actors there. There are a lot of different agendas, priorities, whether it's on preservation or community rights or commercial rights to forestry, or now RED, reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. One of the things that we saw was that it was very important to have all the different actors, or the key actors, engaging in the discussion about how to manage Liberia's forests, and to have that be a more sustained effort. And so there was the Liberia Forest Initiative, and I think one of the important things about that is that there is a very clear objective that in order to get the Security Council sanctions lifted on timber coming from Liberia, it was necessary to reform Liberia's forestry sector. And there are lots of different interests, different perspectives, different groups. And in that context, there was leadership by the U.S. Forest Service, as well as others, to really make sure that there was a multi-stakeholder approach that involved not only the different international groups and the agencies, but also civil society. And so I think that having certain individuals who believe that coordination is important is profoundly important. So the other thing that I wanted to say was that the coordination takes time, and there were times when we'd be in meetings with the Liberian government and civil society, and somebody in the room would just say, "Tell us what should be in the law." And that wasn't, if we felt it was critical for Liberians to own the results. And so we could say, here are your choices, here are the pros and cons of the different choices, but fundamentally it's up to Liberia to make policy choice. We can then do the technical work of putting it into legal language, but really it's important for Liberians to do that. And that was a time-consuming process, and I think that it's important to recognize that coordination takes time, and in order to invest the time and money in that, we need to believe, we need to see how this is going to make the results more robust and better.
Thank you, Carl, for these great points. Our next question comes from Muse. Thank you, Carl. Do you have a plan to sponsor organizations and environmental activists from least developed countries, particularly from Somalia, to participate in an upcoming environmental peacebuilding conference in Irving, USA? In addition to that, do you have any funding opportunities to promote peace park development for the said countries?
So on the first, we are in the process of reaching out to partners who could support the participation of people, especially from conflict-affected countries like Somalia or Colombia or Sudan or Afghanistan. So we are keen to partner with institutions who could sponsor organizations and individuals to participate in the conference. We don't have those sponsors lined up, so if people have specific recommendations or suggestions, let me know. We are happy to reach out to them. In terms of funding opportunities to promote peace park development in the countries, I'd go back to our earlier discussion, looking at the Global Environment Facility, looking at the CBD's initiative in this area. I know that the funding is limited, so I would defer to Alex and others on how best people would approach on this. I would also part of it, frankly, would be to talk to others who are working on Peace Parks and see how they manage the funding, see if they have recommendations. And that's one area where I think the association facilitates those sorts of discussions. But really, it's about learning from others about how do you find the funding to create a Peace Park? How do you find the funding to keep the Peace Park operating? And so I think that there are multiple important technical questions that there's a lot that people can learn from one another, in addition to some of the more obvious sources of funding.
Thank you, Carl. We just to add to that, we hope that this course will become one avenue for people to talk to each other and exchange advice and expertise. So to all the participants, please feel free to use the course platform to share ideas. Next, thank you. Next, we have a hand raised from Fanuel, and we're going to attempt to open the microphone. Let's see.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking you for the informative answer on my previous question. For now, I just want to get an understanding in terms of Peace Parks development and sustainable development goals that seemingly it's the direction that every country is taking. Where is the integration? Is there any kind of what we can call a conceptual framework, a theoretical framework that is there that stands to guide the integration of sustainable development goals and Peace Parks development? That's question number one. And then also, I would like to know the role of Peace Parks. You know, many a times in these countries that share borders, there are times on one border or the other there is some gross instability and there is a gross abuse of human rights. Since we are saying these are Peace Parks, what role does Peace Parks have, or what we can say, what are the intervention strategies that are there established by Peace Parks foundations to intervene when there is such a gross conflicts and abuse of human rights? And then lastly, I would also like to have an understanding of saying all the problems that we have in the world are a result of elite capture. How would Peace Parks help in reducing such conflicts by eliminating elite capture? I think I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. I was wondering if somebody from CBD or UNDP or somebody, one of the course organizers, might be able to address the SDG question, because I think that's a great question. I suspect that people have thought about that already and have some materials on it.
Yes, absolutely. Alex, I'm going to attempt to open your microphone. A moment. Hoping maybe you could provide some information from the standpoint of CBD. And we have Alex on the line.
Yeah, thank you very much. As you know, Sustainable Development Goals are really rich, and it's not only just 17 of them. You will find at least like 241 indicators supports all goals. And looking at them, we know about goal number 16, sustaining peace and providing support. And many UN institutions provide statistical support, how this goal is implemented. You can actually probably find a report for your country, how this goal is already implemented there, because statistical support from United Nations already has number of very good reports from countries, what is done on the ground. Our particular initiative doesn't really work so much with goals, because we are looking how to establish dialogue. I am sure all activities we do address at least 3 or 4 sustainable development goals, but our major idea is to provide support for people to meet each other, exchange ideas, and discover together what you can do. Because, you know, everybody finds sustainable development goals quite broad at this moment. And again, going back to my previous questions about funding, we don't necessarily see clear dedication of funding for all goals where we can say, if you are looking for, let's say, sustainable goal number 16 implementation, you can follow this path and ask this and this donor about your support. So I see a lot of challenges in implementation at this moment, but all initiatives like ours are here to establish this support and provide a lot of coordination where other participants don't have it at the moment.
Thank you, Alex.
I would add to that, if you look at the report from UN Environment on the environmental rule of law, in the last chapter, there is a graphic that shows the wide range of SDG goals, targets, and indicators that relate to environmental rule of law. And that's broader than the question here, but the point that I think is interesting is how often there are multiple components, whether it's if you have whether it's land or biodiversity or marine, if you talk about livelihoods, security, peace, that there are multiple parts of the SDGs that are important to peace parks, and that peace parks are important to the SDGs. And so I think that the question is a good one, and I think it warrants some further consideration of that theoretical framework for integrating SDGs with peace park development. The second question, the role of peace parks when there are gross abuses of human rights on the other side. This is a really tough question. And I've seen in certain instances, not so much on, it wasn't a peace park, but during the Rwandan genocide, you have the Virungas between DRC and Rwanda and Burundi. That region, extending up into Rwanda, into Uganda, that region is prime habitat for the mountain gorilla, and this was an area where the rangers had protected, had worked with one another for a number of years. When the genocide came to Rwanda, you saw the rangers on one side of in DRC taking in the rangers from Rwanda and their families, so that they had some safety and support. That did not in any way address the genocide at the large scale. And it's really hard. And I think that peace parks have a lot of benefits. They also have their limitations in the sense that they're not going to necessarily be able to be the solution for every problem, and they can help in certain ways, and I think that they are critically important in multiple ways. But I think that when there are sometimes dynamics that are bigger and at a politically higher plane that make it where peace parks are not able to help as much as one would like. And I think that's the reality, that it's an important tool, It has its uses, it has its limitations, and it's not going to be the solution to preventing genocide or to being able to intervene easily, but it still can help in some discrete ways. I would welcome other people's thoughts on this, because I think that this is it's a really good question, and it's also one for which I would like to have better answers. The other question of reducing elite capture of resources, I think that that is where there has been bottom-up process that says we believe that these areas are important for livelihoods, for cooperation, for good governance. Where there's been a bottom-up process, I think that peace parks in many ways represent the broader community will. They also generally restrict the ability to extract resources that are often where elite capture of resources happen. So I think that there are opportunities for peace parks to improve governance by addressing elite capture, by preventing it. That tends to be more often from bottom up, but I'm glad that the person, Manuel, raised that point.
Thank you very much, Carl, for your answer to this question. I'm sure that a lot of questions from participants could keep coming. However, we are quickly reaching our allotted time. So unfortunately, we need to wrap up the session for today. However, I'd like to remind the participants that they can review Carl's presentation, which will be uploaded in the course room under the Week 3 tab, and we can continue this discussion about all the points that have been raised during today's presentation and the Q&A session. Now, this was the last webinar session of the Peace Park Development and Management MOOC, and some of you and many of you might just be 1 hour away from the course completion and receiving the course completion certificate. So I'd like to remind everybody to engage and to just take a couple of hours to complete the requirements if you haven't already. And if you have any questions along the way, please let us know. Best of luck on the finish line. Carl, I'd like to thank you very much again for your time today and for sharing your expertise. I'm sure this conversation has inspired a lot of upcoming discussion in the course, which we hope will continue after the course is over.
Well, thank you. And I thank people for very interesting comments and questions. This was, I am very impressed by the quality of the discussion.
Thank you. And a lot of thank yous are coming now in the chat of your presentation. Best of luck in all your work, and best of luck to all the participants with completing the course. I'm Victoria, and on behalf of Learning for Nature and the course partners, thank you for joining the session today, and have a great day or evening.